Hello everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we are back again. I'm now going to talk about the Snyder Cut and give my overall feelings and thoughts about this. This has been a very highly debated and controversial subject really over the last 2 years following the release of Justice League back in 2017. So the recent announcement of course was that the Justice League original version of the superhero movie has been announced that it's going to air on the HBO Max channel in 2021. So over the course of this video, I'm going to talk about what the Snyder Cut is, why it's happening, the perception of fans in terms of whether this has been a kind of victory for the people who have supported the Zack Snyder version, the elements in terms of social media and the impact that it can have on mainstream companies and studios alike, and what will be the ongoing effects going forward of the entertainment industry, and also whether it does a disservice to the DC cinematic universe and the characters involved overall. Is this the right direction? Does this serve good in terms of us getting the right version and the right interpretations that I believe these characters deserve in the long run? So this is going to be quite a lengthy discussion. It may be two-part video depending on how far I get beyond the points on here. So that's a quick summary overhaul. So I'm going to go more into depth now, and before I do, I think it's best just to establish what exactly the Zack Snyder Cut is. So the Snyder Cut is essentially Zack Snyder's original version of the Justice League movie that is incomplete in terms of all the effects and the audio. So the principal footage with all the actors and all the physical scenes, they were all completed, but it still needed the post-production work in terms of the editing, in terms of the CGI, and in terms of the sound and the soundtrack and the musical score. All of those elements still had to be added in. So what basically happened was, going through this process, Zack Snyder was unable to finish this version due to a personal tragedy. He walked away from the product. Joss Whedon was brought in and various changes were made, such as cutting down the runtime and the overall tone of the film. There was a much more brighter, more humorous, comedic flavour felt and brought in to the original version. It was released to a very lukewarm and negative reception. Following the inquest over the box office underperformance of Justice League, more and more information and details leaked out about Zack Snyder's original version and the plans going forward. We all know there was initially meant to be a two-part adaptation of the Justice League, and later on we were going to get the likes of Darkseid and Green Lantern involved. So as fans collated and got more information, a following began. A petition began online to release the original Zack Snyder version, and people were kind of looking for a much more of a vindication or closure, if you like, to see how the original version would turn out, and maybe if the original version would be released, maybe that could have maybe turned the tide with the perception of the DCU. So we've had this going on for 2 years now. Is there a Snyder Cut? Is there not a Snyder Cut? Does it exist? Does it exist? Is it complete? Is it not complete? Will it be released? So that debate has been going on for the last 2 years, and now we've seen now that that discussion has come to fruition, and Warner Brothers and with HBO are finally going to take the plunge and fund enough budget to see this original version of Zack Snyder's realised. So that's basically the overall summary of what the Snyder Cut is and what it means going forward. So I'm going to go now in depth as to whether I think it's worth the hype, all the time, all the attention that's been focused on it for the overall 2 years. Okay, so to do that, I'm now going to go back to the beginning, you know, the original inception of this idea and of this following. So we have to go back now to 2012, and initially we go back to the release of Marvel's Avengers. This of course was the first wave or the first phase of completion of their huge undertaking of where they were going to take their B tier and C tier superheroes, introduce them standalone first, and culminate together in a massive team up movie. We of course saw the likes of Iron Man released in 2008 with his first film, then again with Iron Man 2 in his second film. We then had Thor in 2011 released, also with Captain America in 2011 release. Also we had the kind of reboot of the Incredible Hulk starring Edward Norton and directed by Louis Leterrier as well, back in 2008 as well. So the Avengers, when it released in 2012, was a huge landmark, a moment. That movie really changed the whole entertainment industry, hugely influential, hugely pivotal and important, really, to what we're seeing in the changes now. And what it done, it opened up the landscape, both from an entertainment point of view and a social point of view. You know, it was now okay to like comic book characters. It was culturally okay to enjoy these comic book characters and delve into the source material, and it became a lot more popular within the mainstream appeal. We now saw that the doors are open, so you could have characters like Deadpool, like Guardians in the Galaxy, come to the forefront, have their own movies made, and they could generate huge box office numbers at the box office. We've seen later on when we had Captain Marvel, we had a Venom movie minus Spider-Man, we had Shazam, we had Aquaman. All of those doors are opened to massive mainstream appeal and massive mainstream success. We saw within television the likes of Daredevil, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, Supergirl, Doom Patrol, Teen Titans. All of these properties that they had a following, but not in the mainstream in the same that you would associate with the likes of Spider-Man or Superman or Batman. Now they were getting focused. Now they were getting a spotlight, right? So we had a landscape now where all of these comic book characters can thrive, and most importantly, they could thrive looking as they were. It was now okay to show them as they appeared within the comic book panels. So that terms of landscape, you'd like to think the DC characters should flourish, right? Because you have Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Those three in particular, those are three of the top 5 most iconic superheroes of all time in terms of pop culture, in terms of iconography. If you were to do a long list, who are the most iconic and most well-known superheroes? Not necessarily the best, because that's another debate that we could have separately. But in terms of recognition, in terms of familiarity, in terms of people being comfortable with who they are and where they come from, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the trinity of the DC heroes, would definitely come in the very least in the top 5 or at the top 10 at the very least. Okay, so in this landscape that I've just previously described, the DC heroes should not only be able to have massive success, they should be able to really dominate, right? Because they've dominated before. We saw, of course, with the Richard Donner movies, especially the first 2, starring Christopher Reeve, still the most iconic, still the benchmark version of Superman. We also saw later on with Tim Burton movies, Batman in 1989 and later on in Batman Returns in 1992. That interpretation, hugely successful and culturally important back then. So it's very, I'll use the term inverted commas, easy, or it should have been easy, to introduce these DC characters within this current landscape and have massive super success with other characters. So when we move on to Man of Steel, and we could talk so much about this movie, but in general it proved to be primarily the most diversive Superman movie we've ever seen in terms of maybe cinematically or in terms of the small screen. This was them going for a much more realistic, more grounded tone. They wanted to veer away from the more colourful, proactive, positive approach that we've seen so far throughout a lot of material in the past, whether you look at the Christopher Reeve versions in the movies, or whether you look more from the Tom Welling in Smallville, or the Superboy television series that we had in the mid to late 80s, and also if you had with the Bruce Timm animated versions from the Superman animated series, and also with the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. They wanted to kind of build a connection to the success that achieved with the Dark Knight trilogy, where you're looking at a much more of a realistic tone, right? But unfortunately, this version of Superman really alienated and discouraged fans. They looked at the fact, we could go through it and spend a whole debate, the fact that Jonathan Kent was telling Clark that maybe he should let people drown instead of saving them, the fact that Clark failed to save his dad when he could have easily done so. We had the whole city destroying sequence in Metropolis where Superman is not looking to avert the battle or take the battle somewhere else. We have, of course, the climatic act where Superman kills Zod at the end. The point you had here is that people went to this movie, they looked at Superman and said, that's not Superman. That's not the character that we know. That's not the character that we've grown to love or grown to identify with. Whether we're 20 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old, this is not an appropriate fit for the character. Okay? Now, people may have been fans of the Zack Snyder version, that's fine, and whether you liked it, but the fact is, the reception of Man of Steel, the general consensus was this was not an appropriate fit for the character. People went to that film, coming out of it, not feeling that this was a Superman that they could connect to. This was a Superman that they could relate to. They didn't like the whole deconstructive take of the character. The fact that he was burdened by having a role of a hero. He seemed to run away a lot from his problems. He didn't look to embrace the role of being the protector and the saviour of the people and of the world. Okay, so in that aspect, okay, this was a failure. Zack Snyder, with this interpretation of Superman, had failed to make that character transcend to audiences, as I described before, in that landscape, the way that Deadpool transcended over, Guardians of the Galaxy transcended, Iron Man, Captain America 4, all of these other characters managed to make a big connection with audiences, and Superman didn't. Okay? You've got the number one most iconic superhero within all of popular culture, and you failed to have him transcend and make a good connection with today's audiences. That was a failure. We then move on to Batman versus Superman, and we have the whole scenario again. Warner Brothers had done a post-inquest and assessment of Man of Steel, and they felt that despite the fact it grossed over 668 million at the box office, which for me was a good box office take for a franchise starting again after the lukewarm reception to Superman Returns back in 2006. There was kind of a 7-year gap. So I felt 668 million for a divisive Superman was a good box office result. But Warner Brothers didn't feel that way. They were expecting $1 billion. They wanted to match the box office take matched by the Avengers and the MCU movies, and they weren't prepared to invest the same kind of development and progression that the MCU movies did. So what did they do? They kind of panicked and went back to the regular playbook of relying on Batman. They brought Batman in. They announced, of course, that Ben Affleck was going to take the role, and we announced that this was going to be a Batman versus Superman. We all remember those massive, fan excited reactions that we had on Comic-Con when they made the announcements. This was going to be based on Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, which involved an eventual confrontation between the two. We later on realised that we were going to introduce Wonder Woman in this role, Gal Gadot's first introduction, and of course the first big screen introduction of Wonder Woman cinematically. We were also going to have Lex Luthor in terms of J.C. Eisenberg, and we later on through various trailers found out that they were going to confront and fight Doomsday as well. So they went all out, they went all in. As we know, this was kind of like, if not a complete Justice League movie, but a Justice League prototype, if you like, version being introduced. And this was Warner Brothers wanted to try and cash in and get the $1 billion box office that was achieved by Marvel's Avengers. Now, what I felt we should have got was a standalone Superman sequel where we kind of ironed out all the mistakes and errors within Man of Steel and make sure that we got a Superman that connected well with audiences, and then we start off branching out, having standalone films for the other DC characters, your Flash, your Wonder Woman, your Green Lantern, and then maybe we go back to Batman having a long extended break from the completed Dark Knight movies, and then once we establish a further connection with all of those characters, then we bring up the team-up movie. But no, they didn't want to do that. They threw all their eggs in the basket. Batman vs Superman came out, and okay, it had a massive opening. What was it, around 170 to 180 million box office weekend? It went on to strive to grow around about 875 to 890 million at the box office. Now, people will say, yes, that's a very good box office take, but when you're dealing with these iconic superheroes of the DC mythology, as I mentioned before, pop culturally known by everybody, and more importantly, this was an occasion where it was Superman and Batman on together, the screening for the first time. This is Wonder Woman's first cinematic appearance. This should have been huge. This should have been $1 billion plus easy. Even more than $1 billion, because again, you're dealing with the Trinity together on screen for the first time. All of those trailers, we saw those shorts together where we had Henry Cavill's Superman, Ben Affleck's Batman, and Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman together, standing on that pose together, if you like, the Holy Trinity on screen. This should have been a massive success. This should have been equal, even better than what the recent Marvel movies had achieved. So once again, because it didn't achieve the massive box office success that Warner Brothers were looking for, but most importantly, it didn't connect, or it didn't transcend well with audiences on a massive scale. Just like people were divided over Henry Cavill's Superman, they were even more so divided with Ben Affleck's Batman. They didn't like this kind of more murderous, kind of more paranoid, more physically brutal take of the Caped Crusader, despite the fact that it was based on the celebrated graphic novel Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. What we have to remember, that was an Elseworld version, okay? That was not a version that was celebrated more by the mainstream audiences. Now, yes, you could argue that maybe both Burton's version and both Nolan's version, they may have taken little elements and incorporated certain facets of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, but in general, they still had a much more of a heroic Batman, if you like, okay? A one that wasn't as brutal and wasn't certainly more violent, if you like, okay? And that's the mistake I felt they made. They felt that because Dark Knight Returns was much more celebrated, but it was really more amongst comic book fans. But amongst the general audiences, this Batman didn't take. So again, as I mentioned with Man of Steel, you have failed in terms of taking an iconic character and making it connect with general audiences and general public alike. Batman versus Superman was a failure, okay? In terms of, yes, okay, people liked Gal Gadot. I mean, she wasn't in this movie long enough to be disliked, to be fair, but in terms of Batman, in terms of Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, in terms of Henry Cavill's Superman, in terms of Doomsday, all the concept and the story and all the mythology, in terms of the mainstream DC comic characters, Zack Snyder had failed. Okay, he failed to build a big connection with which they can build on. So that's when we move on to Justice League. So we had, as I explained before, everything that had gone on with the production, the issues going on there. So the dilemma was, of course, that they had already announced Justice League and Justice League Part 2. Zack Snyder had already began shooting for Justice League shortly after Batman vs Superman had just released. So they kind of couldn't go back and they couldn't reverse that out, okay? So what happened was Zack Snyder had finished around about 70 to 80% of his Justice League vision. They had early screenings and Warner Brothers, some executives, they didn't like it, so they asked Zack to go back again and make a few changes and adjustments. And then, of course, we had the sad tragedy of his daughter committing suicide, so he had to walk away, and Joss Whedon had to come in and finish off the project. Now, when Justice League had its underperformance, it grossed around 657 million worldwide. A lot of people were blaming Whedon, but I don't subscribe to that, because you have to remember the majority of this was still the Zack Snyder vision. It was still the Zack Snyder DNA that was built in, the kind of visual aesthetic. If you go back and watch Justice League, yes, there are clear markers where you can see where it's Snyder's version and whether it's Joss Whedon's version. But remember, Joss Whedon was only coming in and called in at the last minute. He had, 8 to 10 weeks or maybe 8 to 12 weeks to finish off this project. So this wasn't his version from the start. So I don't believe you could actually blame a lot of Joss Whedon for coming in and kind of at the last minute, if you like, to finish off this movie. And if you actually go through the critical perception of Justice League, the elements that people liked were the brighter, more humorous parts. The fact that Superman seemed to have a lot more of a charisma, he was smiling a lot more, the suit looked a bit brighter. There was a dynamic and chemistry between him and the Flash. People liked a lot the kind of end credit sequence where we see Superman flying away on there. So the actual fact that the Justice League, the worst elements were indeed the Zack Snyder elements. The Zack Snyder DNA were the elements that people didn't like the least. Okay, right? So despite the fact that Josh Whedon came in, and yes, we had all the controversy over the Henry Cavill mustache and the fact that the directors, we found out, they wanted to keep Justice League under 2 hours so it could fit in with their financial results and meet their quota within the quarter so they could then achieve their bonuses. Again, very scandalous in my eyes that that sort of thing went on. Again, it just highlights again how much negligence, if you how much non-care was going into these characters. But again, you have to primarily blame the Zack Snyder vision. This was the Zack Snyder DNA, and it failed to connect. So whether we look at Man of Steel, or we look at Batman vs Superman, or we look at Justice League, okay, this was a failure of the DC characters to make them connect to a mainstream audience. So when we look at the Snyder Cut, okay, and the fact that it's going to go back to be a lot more of what Zack Snyder had originally envisioned, we kind of had to gain a bit of perspective here, because what we have to realise is, despite the statements of any articles that this is going to be something completely different, it's still going to have the Zack Snyder tone, the Zack Snyder direction, the Zack Snyder aesthetic, the Zack Snyder interpretation of these characters. We're not going to look at a completely different movie here, because that would be impossible. He doesn't have the time or the capacity, particularly in this current pandemic situation that we're in now, to completely go back and redo what he's done. What he's going to do is go back and finish off the last remaining parts that he has to finish in terms of adding the CGI and the effect shots and completing it. There's not going to be any reshoots. We're not going to have any scenes where the actors film extra parts to it, right? Because of this whole pandemic thing. At best, of what I've read, it's going to be maybe voiceovers or dubs by the actors involved in it. But we're not going to get completely different storylines here. We're going to run through and complete the Zack Snyder vision, which, as I've outlined before, was a failure. So how and why are we getting excited about this? Why are we getting excited about a treatment of the DC characters that failed? It's going to be the same style. It's going to be the same philosophy used for these characters. It's not going to be any different. So when I see all of this excitement and all of this hype about it, I question it, because I think you're hyping over something that was a failure. You're hyping over something that didn't connect with audiences. You're hyping over something that was a mishandling and mistreatment of these DC characters. Now, if you are a fan of Zack Snyder's work and you're a fan of his style and his visualization of these DC characters, then yes, okay, you have got what you wanted. So I guess this kind of argument that I'm presenting isn't really for that kind of demographic, that fans of Zack Snyder work. Then you've got what you wanted, right? Okay. Now, if you're also coming across from a perception of people who have managed to send tweets and make an impression online and see that impression have a major impact mainstream within the film company, then yes, again, you've got what you wanted, because you like the fact that fans can go online, speak passionately, have a voice, and have that voice listened to. So you've got what we wanted. But I'm coming across it more from a treatment of the DC characters and how they've been mistreated. And all the Snyder Cut to me is a furthering mistreatment of those characters. Zack Snyder, he's not going to listen to all the people that had issues with Man of Steel, that had issues with Batman vs Superman, and think, right, I'm going to completely reconfigure this and change it. Okay? He's not going to do that. The studios aren't going to lean on Zack Snyder to make those changes, because what would be the point? They've tried that already when they brought Joss Whedon in to very unsuccessful results. So they're not going to ask Zack to do the same thing. And as I said, especially in this current times of pandemic, it's not going to be physically impossible for him to kind of reconfigure the whole project. So when we get the Snyder Cut in 2021, what we're going to see is a continuation. Now, if we look at various kind of articles and stories, like I said before, but there's elements involved where we're going to get Green Lantern maybe more introduced. We've seen online, of course, that we're going to get introduced of Darkseid involved. Whereas in Justice League, we had the version where Superman wore the red and blue costume. In the original cut of Zack Snyder version, that didn't happen with Superman. Superman was, I believe, was going to get taken under Darkseid's control, and we were going to get a version where Darkseid had boom tubed into kind of the Batcave and he captured Lois. And Superman was going to get a much more of a dark, evil take. And I believe this was going to be one interpretation where Superman dons the famous black suit. Okay? So you're not going to get those brighter elements that you enjoyed in the Justice League movie. No, it's going to go the other way and be a much more of a darker take. Okay? So is that something that really should be getting excited for? Okay? You're going to get more of the same. So if you're a fan of the Zack Snyder movies, fine. But if you're not a fan, or you're kind of indifferent, then what is this excitement about? So when I see this whole release of Zack Snyder Cut and all this online movement, you have to bear in mind that whilst there will be people who like the Zack Snyder version, there's going to be a lot of people within this movement that don't really care. They're kind of jumping on the trend, jumping on the bandwagon. They're not really that bothered. And I suppose we'll get a better gauge of that when we come to the subscription numbers of HBO Max, and we find out when we release the Snyder Cut in 2021, how many of those subscription numbers will they get? How many people will actually pay the kind of $10 or $15, whatever the asking price is, to actually buy into that Justice League? Okay, now if the Justice League Zack Snyder version was redone and ready to go for when the streaming app launches, I think it's this week, I think it's in the next couple of days, then we would get a better perception, right? But what you have to understand is by next year, and of course we don't know next year, I mean, I don't believe we're going to get it January next year. It could very well be June next year, July next year, maybe September, November next year. Again, we don't know, or this depends rather on how smooth the process is of the post-production. So this could be a long way off before we get it, okay? But we won't know the true perception of the Snyder Cut until we get those subscription numbers in. And again, you have also the other issue of when you start going to streaming and putting movies online, a lot of people are going to pirate it, they're going to torrent it. Of course, we don't condone that, but that's just the fact of life. When you put an online copy, it's kind of open and it's kind of fair game for people to exploit and use to their own desires, right? So that's another issue, and this is again why I've never agreed with cinematic movies going straight to streaming or video on demand. I think you should always try and make an effort as much as you can to release them theatrically, okay? So from that perspective, again, we're looking at a project, at a philosophy, at an interpretation that failed the DC characters, that failed the DC heroes in terms of pulling them into the mainstream. So should we really be celebrating the Snyder Cut? Should we really be celebrating the fact that it's managed to come to fruition and it's going to come back in some way, shape or form? I don't agree with that. I feel that, again, this is a kind of misguided way, well, first off, of Warner Brothers building up content, because I've seen some entries of what they're going to promote with HBO Max when it launches. It's nothing that special. So again, they need new thriving content. I think this is them looking at what's trending. They've seen this massive online movement within their release of Snyder Cut, and they're thinking, right, we can use and exploit this and get this version out, and it will be a good way to kind of gain subscribers. So from a business and commercial point of view, I can understand that. That makes complete sense, of course, what they're doing on here. But again, I look at it more from a treatment of the DC characters. I've always maintained that if you handle the DC characters with the same care and attention that the Marvel characters were with Marvel Studios, then a DC cinematic universe would trump the MCU. I still firmly believe that. I know people will argue, they won't agree with that, and there can be valid counter arguments as maybe that won't be the case. But I truly believe when you're dealing with Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, these truly iconic characters, and yes, not only just them, but the Flash is very well known, Green Lantern is very well known. If you can get that nucleus of characters transcending well amongst current audiences, where they can really show a big massive favoritism towards them, whether you're young, whether you're middle aged, whether you're older, you can use that kind of favoritism to branch out into the other DC characters, and I believe that would have been every bit as successful, maybe even more successful as what the Marvel Cinematic Universe was. So this is not a property that can't be successful, that can't be translated well to the big screen. These aren't redundant characters that nobody cares about. These are characters that are very much prolific, okay? So you have a very successful and very profitable franchise or mythology that you should be able to translate to the big screen the way that is translated to other formats, yet you fail to do so. A continuation of the Zack Snyder direction is, for me, a continued failure of the DC superhero characters. And this Snyder Cut, this Snyder version, whenever it comes about, it may be a good movie. I'm not kind of dismissing the fact that it could be a good movie, because at the very least we could argue it's going to have a much more of a cohesive feel towards it as opposed to what we got in 2017, when it's going to be disjointed. And of course it's going to be disjointed because you've got two filmmakers with two completely different ideals and approaches to filmmaking and how superheroes should be interpreted. Of course it was going to be disjointed, and of course it was going to be a mess, which is what it turned out. So yes, okay, it's going to be much more consistent and well put together in terms of its tone, but I still feel it's going to be a failure within the DC heroes because it's just going to continue. And on that basis, and through all the other elements I've talked about in the first part of this video, you're dealing with a failure of interpretation within these characters, and I just think that's going to carry out throughout, and that's why I don't feel that the Zack Snyder version is going to be worth the time and it's going to be worth the hype that's being bestowed upon it by various fans and critics alike. But those are my thoughts at the moment. I'm going to do a separate video now where I'll talk a bit more about the fans' perception in terms of whether this is a victory or some sort of win for fans in general, and the toxic fandom or the perception, if you like, or toxic fandom surrounding this Snyder Cut. But those are my overall thoughts in this part one of this coverage covering the Snyder Cut. Again, I just feel that I would want to see much more focus on getting the rebooted version of the cinematic universe starting again, primarily just getting a Superman sequel. That would be a start, and then pushing on with a Green Lantern movie, getting that right, and getting a Batman movie that can transcend towards audiences. That's where I would like us to start. And the fact, we've got a Wonder Woman movie in 1984, we've got a Batman movie that is rumoured to take place in the 90s. We've got no news yet of whether an Aquaman sequel is coming out, no news of whether a Shazam sequel is coming out. All of this, to me, along with pushing forward the Snyder Cut, it's Warner Brothers trying to avoid the fact that eventually they've got to admit that they have failed in terms of building a cinematic universe, and that they need to reboot and start again. This is kind of content, kind of just divert attention away from the fact that they really need to now focus more on what I believe in starting again and rebooting the cinematic universe, instead of pushing forward with this Snyder version that we're going to see in 2021. That's my overall feelings and thoughts regarding this Snyder Cut version on here. Okay, so those are my extensive kind of assessments on here. I know this is quite a lengthy video, but let me know what you think in the comments below. I suppose rather that this video is going to get disliked a lot because a lot of people are excited about this Snyder Cut. But you let me know what you think in the comments below, and as I said before, I will provide a second video regarding my thoughts and opinions on this. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves. Stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.